Hi there, it's Agnia from Brisbane, Australia, and welcome to the Hazard Awareness Training session. This training has been formatted to allow a single session rollout or a rollout of multiple sessions. If you are presenting and completing this training in one single session, then please use your YouTube link on the top left-hand corner of the page. If you are presenting and completing this training over multiple sessions, then please use the links that are embedded within the slides. We will be talking about hazard awareness. So this includes definition of hazard, hazard assessment, and hazard recognition. Following the introduction, we will then discuss about risk assessment and how this ties within hazard awareness. This is where we will discuss about hazard identification and the steps we need to take to eliminate or control the hazards. So what are the objectives of this training session and what are we aiming to get out of this? So during this session, we aim to discuss about risk tolerance. This is a prompt for you to think about things that influence your decision-making process and how you can assess and identify acceptable risks. It is also important that you are able to identify health, safety, and environmental hazard that are associated with a job task that has been assigned to you. Lastly, this training session will also assist you in applying risk reduction methods to ensure that you are well equipped with a tool to effectively analyze risk assessment. We as employees have the duty to take care of the health and safety of ourselves, but also the health and safety of those around us. Hazard awareness and identification is a vital component to the risk management process. So with hazards that we may not be aware of, we'll not go through the risk management process. And this ultimately leads to the non-identification of preventive measures for harm prevention in the workplace. So now I'll be posing a question for all of you to elaborate. So what's the definition of a hazard? A hazard is identified as an unsafe act or condition which may result in injury or damage. So what is a hazard assessment? This is a process for evaluating tasks or situation in order to determine the actual or potential hazards. And then I will be asking you one last question, which is what this session is all about. What is hazard recognition? This is a process of recognizing a condition or behavior which could ultimately result in harm. Now moving on to risk. So what does this mean? Risk is defined as the probability of injury or damage. This is in relation to the potential severity of the particular injury or damage. When it comes to risk analysis, this is the evaluation of the risks done to determine future actions. Through the risk analysis, you compare the opportunity of injury or damage against the reward for completion. Last but not least, risk tolerance. This is the level of risk an individual would be willing to accept. This is based on personal experience, desire for reward, or understanding of the consequences. One thing that you got to keep in mind is that risk and hazard are two different things. A hazard is a fact. Risk is a subjective measurement we place upon a fact that is influenced by the factors we just discussed previously. It is important that you also consider both objective and subjective reasoning. These can be addressed through completing risk assessments for your job, such as the use of job safety analysis, field level risk assessments, and completing a stop and think before you commence a task. An example would be capturing and tagging alligators. So here's an example that I'm about to throw in. There is no denying that hazards would exist. To a regular person, the risk involved within this activity would be unacceptable. However, to biologists and scientists who do this all the time, the risk may be minimal. But why is that? Potential reasons could be due to experience, knowledge, and the availability of resources, and many more. So risk assessment is done in two parts. So this is where you start off by assessing the probability, then followed by assessing the severity. When you assess the probability of the risk, it could be that a risk is unlikely to occur, likely to occur, or that you are almost certain that it could occur. Then you've got the severity. This is where you assess the overall consequences if the risk were to occur. Let's bring back the example of capturing and tagging alligators, which I've mentioned previously. Say, if an individual were to receive a few scratches from this particular activity, then it could be that an individual may require to receive first aid treatment. If that's the case, then the severity would be marginal. If the alligator were to be defensive and decided to take a bite, this could leave the individual wounded where they would require medical treatment beyond just receiving first aid. If that's the case, then the severity would be critical. Worst case scenario, if the alligator decided to attack the individual, this could lead to lost time, disability, or even fatality. And if that's the case, then the severity would be catastrophic. When you're assessing hazards and risk, it's important that you conduct some general observations. Use your senses to look, listen, smell, and feel. When you're looking, this means looking above, below, behind, or inside. Listen for unusual sounds. Referring back to the alligator example that I've mentioned, what happens when you start hearing suspicious growling sounds? It is also important that you use your sense of smell to identify any unusual odors. And last but not least, you should feel in any case you detect unusual temperatures or vibrations. So now, as we are aware, our decision-making process are often influenced by different factors. So this may include personal factors, situational factors, organization factors, and human factors. Now let's have a look at the risk standard matrix. So this is a simple tool to aid in determining the risk. The benefit of utilizing this tool is that it takes subjectivity out of the mix because it's based on actual occurrence probability. While this doesn't determine whether we do or do not do something, this can provide insight to the required mitigation efforts. So now that we've discussed about risk assessment, let's see how we can apply this to aid with hazard awareness. So kicking off with step 1, and that is to identify possible risks. The process to assess risk begins with risk identification, and we do this through planning processes. When we're evaluating our task and the environment, we need to do so with questioning attitude. We need to determine the opportunities for failure, and if we do that, rather than just focusing on what we've always done to work safely, we can truly begin to prevent incidents. So now we will be implementing the risk matrix, which we've discussed previously. For each hazard, you must assess and rate the risk and severity. Let's look at the matrix as we go. Green indicates that this is something that should not be ignored, but is not the primary focus either. In some cases, awareness and wearing PPE should be sufficient to prevent exposure. Then we've got yellow, and this indicates that action is required. Being aware of the risk will not be enough. This is where the primary focus of hazard elimination will come in. Finally, we've got red, and this indicates that the job cannot proceed without proper consultation with the HSSES and the management team. You must develop a path to reduce the probability and exposure, or else apply elimination or do not do the task. So now we've come to an end or the last step of the risk assessment process, and that is to mitigate the risk. When you're doing this, ask yourself some questions. So are you able to eliminate the hazard? Are you able to minimize associated risks? Would you need any support or assistance to do the above? Would there be better time to do the work? Are you going to need to inform relevant stakeholders? What tools, equipment, or PPE would be required? Are there any permits that you require, or should isolation come to play, and what lockout is needed? Or are there any policies or procedures relevant to the task that you will need to utilize for the process? So to wrap this session up, we will now move on to an exercise. This should be a verbal exercise and an opportunity to complete a field level risk assessment or anything that's equivalent. I will be showing you an image shortly, and what you got to do is, when looking at the image, is to identify the hazards, assess the risks associated with the hazards that you can identify, and last but not least, develop a safe solution to plan or mitigate the risks. You will then be given a few minutes to do so. Good luck.